Picture, if you will, a world before the footprint of man grew heavy upon the earth, a time when the horizon was defined not by stone towers, but by the colossal silhouettes of the masters of the grass. In this distant epoch, the air hung thick with the scent of wild sage and damp earth, a sprawling stage where gravity seemed to hold a lighter grip. Here, the giants moved with a slow, rhythmic grace that shook the very foundations of the soil. They were the Megafauna, great mammoths with tusks like curved ivory lightning, and ground sloths as tall as the trees they reached for. To look upon them was to see life at its most ambitious, a grand experiment in scale and power. They were the silent architects of the landscape, their migration paths carving rivers into the dust, and their hunger shaping the forests into open cathedrals of light. In the soft amber glow of a sun that had not yet seen a city, these titans were the heartbeat of the world. They lived in a slow-motion symphony, unaware that the clock of the cosmos was beginning a quiet, relentless countdown toward a silence they could never have imagined. The Earth, in these deep time reaches of the Pleistocene, was a different character entirely, a vibrant, pulsating entity that breathed through the lungs of the vast mammoth steppe. This was a biome that stretched across the crown of the world, from the wind-swept plains of France to the frozen bridges of Beringia, ending only where the sun dipped into the Pacific. It was a kingdom of grass, but not the fragile, manicured lawns of the modern mind. This was a resilient, golden ocean of nutrient-rich vegetation, a sea of green and gold that thrived under the relentless pressure of millions of massive hooves. In this theater of deep time, the air was crisp, perpetually tasting of frost and the sharp, resinous tang of pine needles. The sky was an infinite bowl of bruised violet and burning orange, unpolluted by the haze of industry, allowing the stars to hang like low-slung lanterns over a world that belonged to the heavy and the huge. To walk through this landscape was to feel the vibration of life in the very soles of one's feet. Long before the first foundations of the Great Rift Valley were stirred by the curious upright gait of our ancestors, the giants had already mastered the art of being. Consider the woolly mammoth, the undisputed sovereign of the North. This was not merely an animal, but a biological fortress, a masterpiece of insulation and endurance. Its fur was a layered history of survival, a dense, woolly undercoat to trap the heat of its massive heart, and long, dark guard hairs that rippled in the subarctic wind like the grasses of the steppe itself. Beneath this coat lay a layer of fat several inches thick, a hidden reservoir of energy, a silent promise against the lean months of the coming winter. Its tusks, those sweeping arcs of calcified memory, grew in rings like the trees they sometimes uprooted. They were instruments of survival, used to plow through deep snow to reach the buried forage, or to engage in the slow-motion, thundering combat that decided the lineage of the herd. When a mammoth moved, it did not merely walk, it displaced the atmosphere. The sound of its footfall was a low-frequency hum, a bass note in the song of the earth that could be felt by other giants miles away, vibrating through the sensitive pads of their feet in a language of seismic whispers. Beside these ivory kings wandered the megatherium, the great ground sloth. In the sun-drenched valleys of the Americas, these creatures stood as tall as the low-hanging clouds. To look into the eye of a ground sloth was to look into an ancient well of patience. They moved with a deliberate, haunting slowness, their massive claws, curved like reaping hooks, designed not for the kill, but for the gentle harvest of the high canopy. They were the balancers of the forest, their sheer bulk allowing them to reach where no other creature could, pulling down the branches of the primeval avocado and the wild gourd. In their wake, they left a trail of scattered seeds and tilled earth, their very existence a form of gardening on a continental scale. They were the heavy laborers of the ecosystem, turning the wheel of life with every slow, deliberate mouthful of green. And what of the others who shared this golden age? The elasmotherium, the Siberian unicorn, a rhinoceros of impossible proportions with a single massive horn that split the air like a prow. The glyptodon, a living tank clad in a mosaic of bone, grazing peacefully while the world revolved around its impenetrable dome. These were not the monsters of myth. They were the apex of a biological philosophy that valued size as the ultimate defense. In this world, to be large was to be safe. To be large was to be a mountain that moved. The predators of the era, the scimitar-toothed cats and the dire wolves, were formidable, yet they lived in the shadows of these titans, waiting for the weak, the old, or the very young. For a healthy adult mammoth, the world was a peaceful kingdom. There was a profound sense of security in the gargantuan, a feeling that this era of giants would endure as long as the sun continued to rise over the grass. The sensory details of this lost world are etched into the strata of the earth. Imagine the smell of a mammoth herd, the musky, heavy scent of wet wool, earth, and digested grass, a smell that would have signaled abundance to any creature capable of smelling it. Imagine the sound of the wind whistling through the hollows of a giant elk's antlers, an expanse of bone spanning 12 feet from tip to tip, a magnificent heavy burden of beauty. The world was loud with the sounds of life, the trumpeting calls of the herds, the snapping of ancient timber, the crunch of frozen earth under tons of pressure. But it was also a world of profound silences. In the deep of the night, when the giants huddled together for warmth, the only sound was the rhythmic, bellows-like breathing of 100 mountains of flesh, a collective heartbeat that synchronized with the rotation of the planet itself. This was the biography of the great body, a study in the power of the massive. The giant's body was a machine designed for a specific set of rules. It required vast territories, thousands of gallons of water, and hundreds of pounds of forage every single day. In return for this high cost of living, the giant received the gift of time. Their lives were long, slow-burning candles. They had the luxury of memory, the capacity to remember the location of a waterhole from a drought 50 years prior. They had the capacity for grief, standing in silent vigils over the bones of their ancestors, touching the ivory with their trunks in a ritual that transcended mere animal instinct. They were the keepers of the Earth's history, their migration routes the very veins through which the nutrients of the planet flowed. Yet within this majesty lay the seeds of a quiet vulnerability. The very traits that made them masters of the Pleistocene, their specialized diets, their long gestation periods, their reliance on vast, unbroken landscapes, were the golden chains that bound them to a world that was secretly beginning to tilt. Evolution had invested everything into the huge, gambling that the environment would remain a stable, endless buffet. The giants were the heavy hitters of the genetic lottery, but they were playing a game where the stakes were about to be swept off the table. They were the silent witnesses to the peak of an era, the high water mark of mammalian size. As the amber light of the late Pleistocene sun stretched across the tundra, It cast shadows that were longer than they had ever been. These shadows were the first whispers of the coming change. The glaciers, those miles-thick sheets of blue ice that had defined the geography of the North, were beginning a slow, agonizing retreat. As the ice melted, the world began to fragment. The vast, contiguous sea of grass began to break apart into islands of forest and patches of bog. The mammoth steppe, the cradle of the giants, was beginning to drown in a rising tide of trees and moss. For a creature that requires 50 miles of open grazing a day, a forest is a cage. For a creature whose feet are designed for the firm, frozen turf, the thawing mire is a trap. In the silence of the genome, the first errors were being made. Not errors of health, but errors of timing. The giants were perfectly adapted for a world that was disappearing. They were like grand, ornate cathedrals built on a shifting sandbar. The countdown had begun, though not a single mammoth or ground sloth could have perceived it. They continued their slow-motion symphony, their tusks gleaming in the fading light, their trunks searching for the last of the sweet grass. They were the heartbeat of the world, but the rhythm was slowing. The era of the small, the quick, and the adaptable was waiting in the wings, watching from the tall grass, holding a sharpened stone and a spark of fire. But for now, in this chapter of our collective memory, the giants still reign. They are the sovereigns of the ancient dust, the colossal ghosts of a world that once knew how to hold a mountain in the form of a beast. We listen to the wind, and if we are very quiet, we can still hear the thunder of their footsteps, echoing across the canyons of time, a reminder of a glory that once was, and a silence that was yet to be. As we linger in this golden afternoon of the megafauna, we must understand the sheer biological bravery of their existence. To maintain such a form in a world of ice and wind was an act of constant defiance. Every calorie was a victory. Every calf born was a miracle of resource management. The mammoth mothers, with their deep maternal wisdom, led their young through the blinding whiteouts of the younger Dryas, their bodies acting as windbreaks against the killing cold. The relationship between the giant and the earth was one of sacred reciprocity. They ate the grass, but they also planted the world. They were the gardeners of the Ice Age, their heavy footprints creating microhabitats for smaller creatures, their dung providing a rich tapestry of nutrients for the next generation of flora. To lose them was not just to lose a species, it was to lose a function of the planet itself. The silence that would eventually follow was not just an absence of sound, but an absence of a specific kind of energy, the energy of the massive. But that silence is still far off. For now, the sun is warm on the backs of the bison that roam in herds of 1,000,000 strong. The giant beaver builds dams that turn whole valleys into wetlands. The cave lion roars from the mouth of a limestone cathedral. And the giants, the magnificent doomed giants, continue to walk. They move with the confidence of the eternal, unaware that they are the final embers of a fire that had burned for millions of years. This was the Golden Age, the time of the heavy heartbeat, the epoch when the earth was large enough to hold the dreams of the colossal. We watch them from the safety of the future, our hearts heavy with the knowledge of what comes next, yet filled with a quiet, sacred awe for the sheer, magnificent scale of their being. The story of the giants is the story of our own cradle. We grew up in their shadow. We learned the world by watching their movements. Our first art, carved into the dark walls of caves by the flickering light of tallow lamps, was a tribute to their power. We didn't just hunt them, we worshipped the idea of them. They were the first gods of the human imagination, beings of such scale that they seemed to bridge the gap between the earth and the sky. As we move forward into the colder, leaner chapters of this history, we must carry this image of the Golden Age with us. It is the baseline of our existence, the memory of a time when the world was vast, the giants were many, and the footprint of man was nothing more than a light, passing shadow on the ancient golden grass. The great clock of the world does not strike midnight with a thunderclap. It moves with the silent, terrifying patience of a glacier. In the long amber afternoon of the Pleistocene, a subtle shift began to ripple through the code of life. A quiet rewriting of the earthly contract that had sustained the giants for an eternity of seasons. It began with a breeze, a stray current of air tumbling down from the high, lonely reaches of the Arctic, a wind that carried a scent the earth had almost forgotten, the scent of a permanent winter. For untold millennia, the world had been a cradle of relative warmth, a lush and humid sanctuary where the pulse of the planet was steady and the sun was a reliable benefactor. But now, the sky began to hold its breath. The atmosphere, once a soft blanket, grew thin and sharp. The cooling was not a sudden catastrophe, but a slow, creeping erosion of the familiar. It was a time of whispers, where the rustle of the drying grass told a story of a world that was beginning to pull away, withdrawing its abundance like a tide that refuses to return to the shore. Imagine a single evening on the edge of the Mammoth steppe, perhaps 40,000 years ago. The sun hangs low, a bloated, blood-red orb sinking behind the jagged spine of a rising ice sheet. There is no sound but the rhythmic scouring of the wind against the brittle stalks of wild rye. In this cooling theater, we find a matriarch, a woolly mammoth whose lineage stretches back through 1,000,000 years of unshakable dominance. She stands still, her trunk raised like a gray, muscular periscope, tasting the air. Within the marrow of her massive bones, a new sensation is blooming, a dull, aching resonance that resonates with the plummeting temperature. Her body, this magnificent biological fortress, was built for the endurance of the ages. Her skin is a rugged landscape of its own, thick as the bark of an ancient oak, layered with fat that had always been a symbol of wealth. But as the wind bites deeper, the heat within her, the central fire of a 4-ton heart, must work harder to maintain its sovereign glow. She is the first to feel the shift in the world's intent. The seasons, once predictable and kind, are growing jagged, their transitions marked no longer by gentle rains, but by the arrival of the frost-thaw cycle that cracks the very stones beneath her feet. This was the first warning, a quiet cooling that turned the lush marshlands into brittle plains of gold. The vibrant greens of the succulent water plants, the high-calorie fuel that powered these mountains of flesh, began to retreat. In their place came the hardy, stubborn tundra grasses, plants that survived by becoming tough, silica-rich, and difficult to master. The giants were beginning to experience the evolutionary duality of their own design. The very size that had protected them from the saber-toothed and the short-faced bear was now becoming a liability. A body of such magnitude is a high-maintenance machine. It requires a constant torrential influx of calories just to stand still. As the landscape leaned toward scarcity, the massive caloric requirements of the giants transitioned from a biological luxury to a heavy, invisible burden. The world was tightening its belt, and the giants were the first to feel the squeeze. The wind whispered of a coming scarcity, a long winter that would last not for a season, but for generations, testing the limits of every heart that beat within a mountain of flesh. Deep within the silent corridors of their cells, the ancestors of these giants were facing a crisis of timing. Evolution is a slow conversation between a species and its environment, but the environment had suddenly changed the language. There was a subtle error in the code of life. Not a mutation of the limb or the eye, but a mismatch of pace. The giants could not reproduce fast enough to adapt to the accelerating rhythm of the cooling earth. A mammoth calf takes 22 months to grow within the darkness of the womb. It is a long, precarious investment in a future that was becoming increasingly uncertain. Each birth was a gamble against the deepening cold. We can see the struggle in the biography of the bone. When we look at the tusks of these ancient individuals today, we see the stress lines, the nutritional winters recorded in the ivory like the rings of a starving tree. These are the diaries of hunger, the physical manifestation of the wind's whisper. The giants were drifting now, their great herds moving with a new restless energy, following the receding green as the frost crept down from the north like a slow white tide. As the ice advanced, the geography of the world was being redrawn. Doggerland, that vast, fertile plain connecting Britain to the European mainland, began to feel the breath of the permafrost. The great river systems, the arteries of the continents, slowed and choked with ice. For the giants, this meant the closure of ancient pathways. Their migration routes, carved into their collective memory over eons, were being severed by the rising walls of blue ice and the expansion of the barren polar deserts. The unease was palpable. In the twilight of the Pleistocene, the social bonds of the mammoths, their profound capacity for empathy and memory, became their greatest comfort and their greatest sorrow. They would stand in the freezing gale, huddling in circles with the calves at the center, their massive bodies acting as a living wall against the elements. Yet, as the grass failed, the milk of the mothers thinned. The ancient memories carved in their instincts began to flicker and fail. The old waterholes were frozen solid, and the familiar valleys were buried under drifts of snow that did not melt when the sun returned. But the cooling breeze did more than just challenge the giants. It invited a new kind of passenger into the theater of the north. While the giants struggled with their mass, a smaller, thinner creature was learning to harness the very thing the giants feared, the cold. Our ancestors, the Paleolithic wanderers, were moving in the wake of the retreating herds. They did not have the thick fur of the mammoth or the blubber of the sloth, but they carried a spark of fire and a mind that could simulate the future. They watched the giants falter. They saw the survival versus vulnerability play out in real time. A mammoth stuck in the newly formed bogs of the thawing permafrost was no longer a god of the steppe. It was a mountain of meat, a providential gift to a tribe that knew how to use every scrap of bone and hide. The wind that whispered death to the giant whispered opportunity to the man. The sensory landscape of this era was one of stark, terrifying beauty. Imagine the sound of the world during this transition, the groan of the ice sheets, a sound like 1,000 shipwrecks happening at once. The smell of the air was clean, metallic, and biting. The texture of life was changing. The soft mud of the marshes was turning into the jagged, frozen, polygonal ground of the tundra, which bruised the feet of the heavy. Even the light was different. The sun, lower in the sky, cast long, distorted shadows that made every shrub look like a predator. In this world of evolutionary duality, the giants were the masters of a world that no longer existed. Their bodies were historical documents, relics of a warm, bountiful past, now forced to survive in a lean, predatory present. Consider the biography of the skin. For the giant ground sloth, the cooling world was a death sentence by degrees. Its skin, once protected by the warm canopy of the southern forests, was now lashed by the grit-laden winds of the expanding pampas. The sloth's metabolism, a slow and steady engine, could not generate the heat necessary to ward off the encroaching chill. It was a masterpiece of efficiency in a world of plenty, but in the world of the whispering wind, efficiency was not enough. You needed intensity. You needed the ability to change, to pivot, to shrink, or to migrate across oceans of ice. The giants were too committed to their greatness. Their bones were too heavy to fly, their hearts too large to hide, and their hunger too vast to be satisfied by the thinning scrapings of a dying steppe. And so the great drift began. The herds moved south, but the south was shrinking. The climate was not just getting colder, it was getting more volatile. The silent errors in the code of life were becoming more apparent. Small populations of mammoths became isolated on islands or in valleys, their genetic diversity evaporating like the morning mist. Inbreeding, that quiet thief of vitality, began to sap the strength of the calves. The tusks grew shorter, the bodies grew smaller, a desperate last-ditch attempt by evolution to downsize the fortress to fit the new budget of the earth. But the wind was relentless. It did not care about the majesty of the past. It only cared about the physics of the present. In the caves of the South, our ancestors were painting these giants. They used ochre and charcoal to capture the essence of the mammoth, the bison, and the woolly rhinoceros. These were not just drawings. They were prayers and records. Even as we hunted them, we felt the sacred weight of their presence. We recognized that we were witnessing the fading of a golden age. The biography of the body of the human was beginning to diverge sharply from that of the megafauna. Where they invested in bone and fat, we invested in the hand and the larynx. Where they moved with the weight of the earth, we moved with the weight of our stories. As the wind continued to howl across the Bering Land Bridge, the silence began to settle in the gaps between the herds. The whispering of the wind was the prologue to the end. It was the moment the earth decided that the era of the giants had reached its conclusion. The transition from the golden age to the age of scarcity was etched into every frozen stream and every abandoned migration path. The giants, those silent architects of the landscape, were being unmade by the very air they breathed. Their history, carved in bone and ivory, was being buried under the advancing white tide, waiting for a future that would one day dig them up and wonder how such greatness could ever have been silenced by something as small as a change in the wind. The world had become a laboratory of endurance. In the Great Rift Valley, the heat still shimmered, but even there, the patterns of rain were shifting. The cradle was rocking, and the inhabitants were being forced to wake up. For the giants, the waking was a nightmare of dwindling horizons. For the humans, it was the beginning of the long trek toward the horizon. The wind continued to blow, a relentless, icy narrator of the planet's shifting moods, carrying the seeds of the new world while burying the titans of the old. And in the heart of the storm, the mammoth stood, a mountain of fur and grief, listening to the whisper that told her the grass would not return in the spring. Chapter 3. The Fragile Crown of Stature. The light of the Pleistocene sun was a pale, filtered gold as it struggled to pierce the thickening mists of a world in transition. In this quiet, cooling theater, the concept of size, once the ultimate decree of biological power, was beginning to undergo a profound and tragic transformation. For millions of years, the strategy of the massive had been an unassailable fortress. To be a giant was to move through the world with the confidence of a mountain. It was a shield forged in the fires of deep time, a defense against the serrated teeth of the cat and the opportunistic hunger of the wolf. In the high, verdant reaches of the Great Rift Valley or the sprawling, ancient wetlands of the Americas, stature was a sovereign right. A creature of 10 tons did not hide, it did not flee. It stood as a silent witness to the frantic, fleeting lives of the small, its only true adversary, the occasional bolt of lightning that split the primeval sky. But as the planet began its slow, frozen dance toward the last glacial maximum, that very majesty, that glorious, towering height, began to feel like a heavy iron crown. We must look closely at the biography of the body for these titans, specifically at the architecture of the bone and the relentless furnace of the heart. To maintain a frame the size of a hill is to engage in a constant, high-stakes negotiation with the laws of physics. Each limb was a pillar of dense, mineralized history, designed to distribute a weight that would crush a lesser being. But a body of such magnitude is not a free gift from nature. It is a loan with a staggering daily interest rate. This is the duality of adaptation. The very mass that offered immunity from predators demanded a mountain of sustenance in return. A single woolly mammoth, wandering the edges of a shrinking forest, required nearly 400 pounds of vegetation every single day. In the lush, humid eras of the past, this was a simple tax to pay. The world was a boundless buffet of succulent willow, birch, and high-protein sedges. Hunger was merely a brief interruption in a life of abundance. But as the silent errors in the code of life met the unforgiving reality of a changing climate, the math of survival began to tilt toward a deficit that no amount of majesty could reconcile. Picture a day in the life of a giant ground sloth, the Megatherium, as the mists of the late Pleistocene begin to settle over the southern plains. He moves with a rhythmic, hypnotic grace, his massive curved claws reaching for the high branches of an acacia tree. In years past, those branches were heavy with soft leaves and sweet fruit. But today, the air is thin and biting. The tree, responding to the cooling soil, has withdrawn its sap, leaving behind only bitter woody scrub and thorns that scrape against the sloth's leathery hide. Each movement for the sloth is a calculation of energy. To lift those colossal arms requires a surge of metabolic fire, a burning of stored fats that are no longer being replenished. He is a masterpiece of a world that is being erased, a biological sovereign whose kingdom has been replaced by a barren, golden wasteland. He stands in the thickening fog, his breath blooming in the cold air like white, ghostly spirits, the only evidence of the internal heat he is struggling to preserve. As the ice retreated and advanced in its jagged, unpredictable rhythm, the giants found themselves trapped in the evolutionary duality of their own design. Their slow metabolism, once a masterpiece of efficiency that allowed them to live for 80 or 90 years, was now an engine that could not pivot. They were built for the long game, for the slow turning of predictable seasons. When the environment began to change with the speed of a human lifetime, the giants were left holding a map of a vanished continent. The succulent flora of the warm interglacials was being replaced by hardy, low-nutrient grasses that were difficult to digest and required even more energy to process. The giants were literally starving in a landscape that looked, to the untrained eye, like a field of plenty. It was a prison of hunger, where every step toward a distant watering hole cost more in calories than the water itself could provide. Consider the biography of the heart within these mountains of fur and bone. The mammoth's heart was a massive pulsing drum, responsible for driving blood through miles of vascular territory, reaching the extremities even as the external temperature dropped to 40 degrees below zero. In the deep time silence of the genome, there were no instructions for this kind of sudden scarcity. There were no quick-fix mutations to shrink the body to a more manageable size within a single generation. Evolution is a poet of the slow and the steady. It does not write in the frantic prose of a crisis. And so, the giants remained giant, their stature a mocking reminder of a wealth they no longer possessed. They were the victims of their own perfection, masterpieces rendered in a medium that the world was no longer willing to support. In the dark of a Paleolithic night, our own ancestors may have watched these wandering ghosts from the safety of a limestone cave. To the humans, huddled around a small flickering fire, the mammoths must have seemed like fading gods. The smell of wood smoke, sharp and acrid, drifted out into the cold air, where it met the musky, heavy scent of the starving herds. The humans were small, their caloric needs a fraction of the giants', and their biography of the body was one of flexibility. While the mammoth was locked into its majestic form, the human could adapt, sewing skins to mimic the giant's fur, sharpening flint to pierce the giant's hide, and moving with a frantic, resourceful energy that the giant could not match. The contrast was stark. The sovereign of the plains was dying of its own greatness, while the scavenger in the shadows was beginning to thrive on its own vulnerability. The texture of the world was changing. The soft, damp earth of the ancient marshes was turning into the hard pan of the tundra, a surface that offered no cushion for the massive weight of the giants. We see them in the mind's eye, their joints aching with the cold, their ancient memories of lush green valleys flickering like dying embers. They were wandering through a landscape that had become a hall of mirrors, where every path led back to the same dwindling resources. The fragile crown of stature was now a burden that threatened to snap the very neck that bore it. In the silence of the primeval forest, the only sound was the crunch of frozen lichen underfoot and the occasional mournful lowing of a calf that would not survive the week. As we track the silent accidents of genetics, we find that the giants were also suffering from the cost of their long lifespans. Because they lived so long and reproduced so slowly, the rate at which they could pass on new adaptive traits was glacial. A mutation that might help a creature survive the cold or process bitter scrub takes thousands of years to become a standard feature in a population of mammoths. By the time the code could provide an answer, the question had already changed. They were outpaced by the very wind that whispered through the grass. The historical world-building of the Earth was moving into a new chapter. The Neolithic was approaching, and the world of the massive was being edited out, line by line, by a cold and indifferent hand. Yet there is a profound beauty in this slow-motion tragedy. The giants did not go quietly into the dark. They fought with every ounce of their colossal will. They moved across the Bering Land Bridge and through the narrow corridors of Doggerland, seeking the last pockets of the world that still remembered the warmth. Their migration paths were the last threads of a web that was being unraveled. Every step they took required a fortune in energy, a biological gamble that rarely paid off. They were the masters of a world of survival versus vulnerability, where their greatest strength had become their terminal weakness. The glory of their stature, which had once commanded the respect of the very earth itself, was now nothing more than a magnificent dying echo in the thickening mists of the Ice Age. In the silence of the modern museum, we stand beneath these skeletons and feel a phantom weight. We are looking at the remains of a biological philosophy that valued the infinite. But the Earth is not infinite. It is a world of cycles, of tightening belts and shifting sands. The giants remind us that no adaptation is permanent, and no throne is secure. As the mists of the Pleistocene close over this chapter, we see the last of the mammoths standing on the edge of a frozen cliff, her breath a final defiant cloud against the coming night. She is the prisoner of her own majesty, a sovereign without a kingdom, waiting for the snow to cover the tracks of the giants forever. The wind that scoured the northern plains carried with it a new scent, a sharp, acrid note that did not belong to the cooling earth or the decaying grass. It was the scent of wood smoke, a chemical signature of a mind that had mastered the sun's own fire. Into this cooling theater of titans, where the giants still moved like slow, ivory-clad mountains, a new element arrived. A creature of bone and sinew, fragile in appearance, standing barely half the height of a mammoth's knee, yet carrying within its skull a spark of terrible ingenuity. We call them our ancestors, the wandering tribes of the late Pleistocene, but to the giants, they were initially nothing more than ghosts. They were shadows that moved with a strange, coordinated purpose, drifting across the landscape not with the thundering weight of the megafauna, but with the quiet, persistent fluidity of water. These were the masters of the flame and the flint, small beings who did not possess the physical strength to topple a mountain of flesh, yet possessed the terrifying vision to see that mountain's end. In the long, bruised purple twilights of the Ice Age, these human tribes followed the retreating ice, their eyes reflecting the hunger of a changing world. To understand the arrival of the shadow, we must look at the biography of the human eye. Unlike the side-mounted eyes of the grazing giants, which offered a wide, panoramic view of the horizon to detect the approach of danger, the human eye was set forward, a predator's geometry. It was designed for depth, for focus, for the ability to lock onto a single point in the distance and calculate the trajectory of a spear. Within the silent code of our life, a subtle shift had occurred, a genetic sharpening of the mind's ability to simulate the future. While the mammoth lived in an eternal, majestic present, the human was beginning to live in the what-if. They looked at the giant not with the simple fear of a prey animal, but with the analytical gaze of a builder looking at a quarry. Where the lion saw a wall of muscle and a dangerous sweep of ivory, the human saw a mountain of resources, a year's worth of fat, a roof made of hide, and tools carved from the very scaffolding of the beast's life. Consider a single night in the heart of Doggerland, that vast, lost expanse that once connected the world before the rising tides claimed it. The air is so cold it feels brittle, and the stars hang low, heavy and brilliant. A small group of hunters huddles in the lee of a limestone outcrop. Their skin, unlike the thick, woolly insulation of the giants, is thin and vulnerable, protected only by the stitched-together memories of the animals they have already outlived. Here we see the evolutionary duality of the shadow. We were the weakest creatures in the tundra, susceptible to the frost, lacking the claws of the cat or the tusks of the bull. Yet this very vulnerability was our catalyst. Because we could not survive the cold on our own, we learned to steal the warmth of others. The texture of the night is defined by the rhythmic scraping of flint against flint, a sound that is the true heartbeat of the new era. Each strike sends a shower of sparks into the dark, a tiny mimicry of the lightning the giants feared. With each flake of stone removed, the hunter creates a silent error in the natural order. He creates an edge sharper than any tooth, a weapon that extends his reach beyond the limits of his own fragile arm. The arrival of the shadow was not a sudden invasion, but a slow, tidal encroachment. As the climate grew harsher and the giants' numbers began to thin, the human presence grew more persistent. We were the silent witnesses to the giants' decline, but we were also the catalysts of the final act. Our ancestors did not need to be stronger than the mammoth. They only needed to be more patient. They practiced the persistence hunt, a strategy of the mind that turned the giant's mass against them. Imagine a day in the life of a hunter tracking a bull mammoth. The human does not rush in. He follows the tracks for miles, for days, staying just at the edge of the giant's perception. He moves with a rhythmic, bipedal gait, an adaptation of the hips and the spine that allows for incredible endurance. While the mammoth must stop to graze for 16 hours a day to power its massive frame, the human carries a small pouch of dried meat and a skin of water. The human is a creature of the long distance, a shadow that never stops moving. Eventually, the giant's heart, taxed by the heat of its own exertion and the stress of the hunt, begins to falter. The shadow closes in, not with a roar, but with the clinical precision of a stone tip. The sensory details of these early encounters are etched into our collective subconscious. The smell of the hunt was a mixture of damp earth, animal musk, and the metallic tang of fresh blood. The texture of the world was the grit of the tundra in the teeth and the oily warmth of animal fat rubbed into the skin to ward off the wind. There was no malice in this pursuit. To the Paleolithic mind, the mammoth was a sacred brother, a being of immense power whose death was a necessary sacrifice for the survival of the tribe. In the dark caves of the Perigord or the Altai, the humans began to paint these shadows. They used the flickering light of the first fires to project the images of the giants onto the undulating stone walls, making the rock itself seem to breathe. These paintings were the first simulations, a way for the human mind to practice the kill before the sun rose. The biography of the hand during this time is a story of increasing delicacy. The same fingers that could crush a louse could also stitch a needle made of bone or carve a flute from a swan's wing. We were becoming the architects of a new reality, one where wit would soon replace weight as the primary currency of existence. As the Pleistocene waned, the relationship between the shadow and the giant became a dance of extinction. We were the ultimate opportunists of the historical world-building of the era. If a giant was injured by the ice or slowed by the thinning grass, the shadow was there. We learned to use the landscape as a weapon, driving the herds toward the mired edges of bogs or the treacherous hidden pits of the permafrost. These were the ancient accidents that rewrote our destiny. Every successful kill meant that a human child would survive the winter, that a tribe could grow, that a culture could begin to take root. But every kill also removed a piece of the world that could never be replaced. We were living in a time of survival versus cost. The cost of our success was the silencing of the titans. The giants, with their slow reproductive cycles and their immense caloric needs, could not withstand the dual pressure of a shifting climate and a relentless thinking predator. The transition was seamless and terrifying. The shadow of the hunter began to fall across the ancient paths, a presence that moved with the persistence of the tide. We see the legacy of this era in our own bodies today, in the way our hearts race at a sudden movement in the dark, in our innate ability to recognize patterns in the grass, in the very structure of our social cooperation. We are the children of the shadow. We are the survivors of the great cooling who learned that the smallest spark of ingenuity could topple the tallest mountain of bone. As the giants drifted toward the horizon, their forms growing faint in the thickening mists of history, the humans stood on the ridge, their spears held low, their fires burning bright against the encroaching dark. They were the new masters of the world, and the era of the giants was being traded for the era of the soul. The silence that followed the giants was not empty. It was filled with the sounds of the human triumph, the laughter of children around a hearth, the chanting of shamans, the rhythmic striking of stone. But beneath that triumph lay a lingering ancestral grief. We had watched the masters of the grass vanish, and in doing so, we had become the sole guardians of a world that was suddenly much quieter and much smaller. The shadow had arrived, and the world would never again be defined by the colossal silhouettes of the past, but by the flickering, restless light of the human mind. The moon hangs low over the Pleistocene horizon, a cold silver eye watching a world that has begun to tilt toward its own ending. In this high, frozen theater of the north, the silence is so heavy it feels physical, a blanket of cold that muffles the breath of the earth. The air is crystalline, carrying the scent of ancient ice and the dry, sweet dust of the Mammoth steppe. Somewhere in the middle distance, the stillness is fractured by the crackle of a dying fire, a small orange defiance against the encroaching dark. And then, a sound that vibrates through the very strata of the soil, the distant, trumpeting cry of a lonely bull mammoth. It is a sound of profound isolation, a mourning song for a herd that has grown too thin to provide comfort. In this moonlit clearing, we are witnessing more than a hunt. We are observing the final choreography of two worlds colliding. The confrontation between the small and the great was never a war of conquest, for the human mind of the Paleolithic knew no such concept. Instead, it was a delicate, deadly dance, a ritual of survival that necessitated the unmaking of a god to ensure the continuation of a ghost. To understand this dance, we must look at the biography of the spear, a tool that was not merely a weapon, but an extension of the human nervous system. Within the silent code of life, a series of ancient accidents had gifted our ancestors with the precision grip, a subtle arrangement of muscles and tendons in the hand that allowed for the casting of a wooden shaft with the force of a falling star. The spear was a masterpiece of evolutionary duality. It was fragile, a thin sliver of yew or ash tipped with a flake of obsidian or flint, yet it possessed the terrifying ability to bridge the gap between the vulnerable and the invulnerable. It allowed the small to touch the great from a distance, circumventing the defensive wall of the tusk and the crushing power of the hoof. In the hand of a hunter, the spear was a needle of fate, a physical manifestation of the intent to survive in a world where the calories required for a single night were often hidden beneath 4 inches of leathery hide and a mountain of muscle. Imagine a day in the life of a hunting party as they shadow a majestic bull through the marshy edges of what would one day be the North Sea, but is now a vast, soggy plain known as Doggerland. The hunters do not move with the frantic energy of the wolf. They move with the patience of the tide. They have spent days observing the giant, learning the biography of the body that the mammoth itself takes for granted. They notice the slow, heavy swing of its massive frame as it turns to face a threat, a movement that takes seconds too long in the high-stakes mathematics of the kill. They identify the softness of the underbelly, the vulnerability of the knee joints, and the thinness of the skin behind the massive ears. They are studying the anatomy of a king, looking for the fraying threads in the tapestry of its defense. But most importantly, they are exploiting the very thing that makes the mammoth so profoundly alive: its social heart. The giants were creatures of deep memory and fierce loyalty. Our ancestors learned that if they could wound one member of a herd, the others would not flee. They would gather in a protective circle, their trunks intertwining in a display of grief and defiance that was older than human language. In these moments, the giants' empathy became their undoing. The hunters, moving in the shadows like a coordinated extension of a single mind, used this loyalty as a tether. They did not need to conquer the whole herd. They only needed to wait for the exhaustion of the vigil. This was the adaptation versus cost of the mammoth's soul. The same emotional depth that allowed them to navigate the complexities of the Ice Age was the very hook that the human shadow used to pull them down. The landscape itself was recruited into this dance. The hunters were the masters of historical world-building, seeing in a simple ravine or a peat bog a weapon of monumental proportions. They would drive the titans toward the treacherous hidden lips of these natural traps, using fire and noise to confuse the ancient instincts of the beast. Imagine the texture of the mud as it claims the foot of a giant, the wet, sucking sound of the earth demanding back the minerals it lent to the bone. In the mire, the mammoth's size becomes its executioner. The more it struggles, the deeper the mud embraces it. In these moments, the primeval forest bore witness to a shifting of the scales that had remained balanced for 1,000,000 years. The giant, with its soulful eyes reflecting the flickering torches of the small, found itself facing a foe that could not be stomped into the dust because it was no longer a physical opponent, but a conceptual one. The flint tip, though tiny, was a silent error in the code of life, made manifest. To the mammoth, whose skin had evolved to withstand the goring of a rival's tusk or the bite of a frost-starved lion, the flint was an anomaly. It was a fragment of the earth itself, sharpened by a mind to a molecular thinness. When it struck, it did not just wound, it unthreaded the life of the king. It bypassed the biography of the skin and sought the biography of the artery. The sensory details of the final moments are a haunting symphony of the Paleolithic. The sharp metallic tang of blood on the cold wind, the heavy rhythmic thud of a heart that is losing its rhythm, and the terrifyingly human silence of the hunters as they wait for the light to leave the giant's eyes. There was no joy in this moment, only a profound, heavy realization of the weight of the sacrifice. As the scales tipped, the evolutionary duality of the human being was fully revealed. We were the creatures who could kill the largest land mammals ever to walk the earth. Yet we were also the creatures who would spend the next 10,000 years mourning them. We see this in the archaeology of the soul, the way mammoth bones were used not just for food, but to build the first architectural wonders of our kind. In the vast tundras of Ukraine, our ancestors constructed circular dwellings made from the jawbones and tusks of the fallen. These were not just houses, they were shrines. To live inside the bones of the giant was to absorb its power, to wrap oneself in the memory of the master of the grass, even as you lived in the world that had replaced it. This was the Neolithic Revolution in its embryonic form, the moment we stopped being merely a part of the ecosystem and began to curate it through the lens of our own survival. The dance of the spear and the tusk was a tragedy of necessity. Without the caloric wealth of the giants, the human brain, that most expensive of biological organs, could never have fueled its own expansion. Our capacity for language, for art, and for the very storytelling that allows us to look back across the eons was paid for in ivory and blood. Every spark of flint that led to a discovery was a spark that had its origins in the desperate need to outthink the massive. We are the inheritors of this unraveling of the old world's guard. Generations faded into dust, yet the trait of the calculating hunter remained, etched into our DNA alongside the ancestral fear of the dark and the primal comfort of the flame. But deep within the marrow of our own history, there is a lingering ghost of the giant. We see it in our fascination with the biography of the body of the mammoth, in the way we tirelessly excavate the permafrost to find a perfectly preserved calf. We are searching for a reconciliation with the king we unmade. The evolutionary duality of the human spirit is that we are both the architect of the extinction and the only being capable of weeping for it. As the night in the clearing finally gives way to a pale, wintry dawn, the fire is nothing but gray ash. The bull mammoth is gone, his mountain of flesh now a resource for the village, his tusks destined to become needles and flutes. The dance is over, but the rhythm of it still beats in our own hearts, a slow-motion echo of the time when we learned that to touch the divine, we first had to sharpen a stone. The silence that settles over the clearing is the silence of a new epoch. The masters of the grass have been superseded by the masters of the shadow. The world is smaller now, and the horizon is no longer defined by the silhouettes of the titans, but by the thin rising smoke of the human hearth. We carry the spear in our memories, and the tusk in our museums, forever bound to the giants by the blood-stained thread of our own emergence. And as you drift into the quiet of sleep, imagine the weight of that history, the heavy, rhythmic grace of the mammoth, and the light, persistent footfall of the hunter, moving together in an eternal moonlit dance through the corridors of your own ancient mind. Chapter 6. The Long Migration to Nowhere. The world was no longer a home. It had become a labyrinth of closing doors. As the great ice sheets of the Wisconsin and Weichselian glaciations groaned under their own impossible weight, shifting and grinding against the bedrock with a sound like the tectonic plates of the soul breaking apart, the giants began a final, desperate pilgrimage. It was a movement born not of choice, but of a fading memory, a search for the lost Edens of their youth. Those emerald sanctuaries where the grass was forever green, the air was soft with the scent of blooming willow, and the water never turned to the lethal, unyielding stone of ice. Across the vast, indifferent continents, from the wind-swept, dust-choked steppes of Siberia to the rolling, increasingly arid hills of the Americas, the great migrations that had once been a celebration of nomadic power were transformed into a slow, rhythmic funeral march. This was the twilight of the Pleistocene, a time when the ancient geography of the planet was being rewritten by a cold and restless hand, and the giants, carrying the weight of an entire biological history on their sagging shoulders, found themselves walking toward a horizon that offered no sanctuary, only the encroaching, absolute silence of the coming snow. Imagine, if you will, the biography of the foot of a woolly mammoth during this long retreat. The mammoth's foot was a marvel of evolutionary engineering, a massive circular pillar padded with a thick, springy cushion of fat and fibrous tissue. In the Golden Age, it was designed to distribute 5 tons of weight across the resilient, frozen turf of the steppe, acting as a sensory organ that could feel the distant thrum of a thunderstorm or the seismic greeting of a far-off herd. But as the world tilted, the biography of this limb became a chronicle of pain. The expanding deserts of the interior, born from a climate that had sucked the moisture from the air to feed the growing glaciers, turned the lush paths into treacherous seas of fine, abrasive silt. With every step, the giant's feet sank into the dust, each stride requiring a fortune in metabolic energy that the thinning vegetation could no longer repay. The survival verses. Vulnerability of the mammoth was now written in the very soil it trod. Its greatness, which once made it the master of the plains, now made it a prisoner of its own mass, unable to cross the widening gaps of barren earth that lay between the shrinking oases of green. We see them now in the fading light of the Stone Age, a solitary bull mastodon standing on the edge of a shrinking forest in the American Northeast. The air here is no longer the humid, rich perfume of his ancestors' woods. It is sharp, dry, and smells of dying spruce. His fur, once a glorious mantle of insulation, is matted with frost and the gray grit of the tundra wind. Within his mind, the ancient memories carved in bone are flickering. He remembers, not through thought, but through the deep chemical pull of instinct, a valley to the south where the rivers once ran clear. But as he moves, he finds the path blocked. To the east, the rising Atlantic, fed by the melting fringes of the ice, has turned the coastal plains into a salt marsh graveyard. To the west, the mountains are choked with impassable glaciers. And everywhere, there is the scent of the shadow, the wood smoke, and the flint tang of the human tribes who have claimed the mountain passes and the river crossings. The giant is running out of room. He is a sovereign whose kingdom has been reduced to a single freezing ridge, calling out into the gathering dark with a low-frequency rumble that travels for miles, yet finds no heart to answer it. This was the adaptation versus cost of the long migration. To move was to survive, but to move was also to starve. The giants were caught in a biological paradox. As the deserts expanded in the heart of the continents, the nutrient-rich mammoth steppe was being replaced by the tundra-clad barrenness of the north and the arid scrub of the south. The silent errors in the code of life that had favored large bodies for heat retention and predator defense were now the very traits that ensured their doom. A smaller creature, a deer, a wolf, or a human, could navigate the fragmented patches of resources, living on the margins of the change. But a giant requires a contiguous world. They needed the historical world-building of a planet that was whole, not a mosaic of isolated pockets. As the corridors of grass were severed by ice and sand, the herds were broken into smaller and smaller groups, their genetic vitality evaporating like the morning mist over a permafrost lake. Consider the biography of the eye in these final travelers. The eye of the giant, dark and soulful, had evolved to scan the vastness of the horizon, to recognize the subtle changes in the color of the grass that signaled the coming of spring. Now, those eyes were clouded with the fatigue of a species that had walked to the edge of the world and found only a precipice. They were witnesses to the evolutionary duality of their own existence, the masters of the plains who were now the victims of the weather. In the glare of the advancing ice, the giants suffered from a spiritual exhaustion. We see this in the way they began to frequent the same drying water holes, their paths becoming deep trenches in the earth, leading nowhere. They were following ghosts, retracing the steps of their mothers and grandmothers in a desperate attempt to find a reality that had already been edited out of the earthly script. The sensory landscape of this funeral march was one of stark, monochromatic beauty. The crunch of snow under a mammoth's hoof was no longer a seasonal sound, but the permanent rhythm of their lives. The smell of the world was becoming sterile, the scent of cold stone, of dry dust, and the absence of the sweet, fermenting rot of the marshlands. In this environment, the biography of the skin became a story of endurance. The thick hides of the giants, scarred by the winds of 1,000 storms, were the last barriers between the internal heat of a dying era and the external cold of the future. But even the thickest skin cannot protect against the vacuum of hunger. The fat reserves, those hidden cushions of survival, were being consumed by the relentless demand of the migration. The giants were becoming hollowed out, their massive frames moving like wooden ships on a sea of white, their bones showing through the thinning fur like the rafters of a ruined cathedral. And as the ice groaned, the humans watched. From the heights of the Great Rift Valley to the limestone caves of Europe, our ancestors were the silent observers of this exodus. They followed the long migration to nowhere with a persistence that was its own kind of tragedy. To the human hunter, the exhaustion of the giants was an opportunity, but it was also a prophecy. We were learning the limits of the earth by watching the masters of the grass reach theirs. The survival versus vulnerability of the giants was a lesson etched into the human mind. We learned to be small, to be quick, to be flexible, because we saw what happened to those who were too large to change. The texture of our lives was defined by the transition, the softness of the mammoth skin cloak, the warmth of the bone fire, the weight of the ivory pendant. We were the scavengers of the giants' decline, building our own golden age on the ruins of theirs. Generations faded into dust, yet the image of the lone giant remained. There is a profound loneliness in this chapter of the earth, the realization that an entire way of being was coming to an end. The giants were not just animals. They were an ecological force, a biological philosophy that had reigned for millions of years. Their disappearance was a slow-motion unraveling of the old world's guard. As they walked toward the encroaching silence, they carried with them the secrets of the primeval forest and the wisdom of the ancient steppe. They were the last of their kind, wandering through a world that had become a graveyard of expectations. The biography of the body, of the last mammoth, is a story of a heart that refuses to stop beating, even when the air it breathes has turned to needles of ice, and the ground it walks upon offers nothing but the memory of grass. In the deep time language of the fossils, we find the evidence of this final pilgrimage. We find mammoth tracks that lead into the sea, where land bridges were swallowed by the rising tides. We find the bones of calves who died not of predation, but of the simple, crushing weight of the cold. These are the silent accidents that rewrote our destiny. If the giants had found their Eden, if the grass had stayed green and the ice had never moved, we might still be living in their shadow, a minor species on the fringes of a titanic world. But the migration had no destination. It was a journey into the void, a passage through the thinning veil between existence and memory. The giants were walking toward a silence they could never have imagined, a world where their trumpeting calls would be replaced by the quiet, restless whispering of the wind through the bones of a lost empire. As you listen to the slow, rhythmic beat of this history, let yourself feel the weight of that final march. Imagine the vastness of the Siberian tundra, the sun a pale, heatless disk on the horizon, and the silhouette of a mammoth herd moving slowly through the haze of a snowstorm. They move with a dignity that transcends their fate, a slow-motion symphony of resilience in the face of the absolute. They are the sovereigns of the long goodbye, carrying the legacy of the Pleistocene into the dark. And as the snow begins to fall, covering their tracks and muffling the sound of their footsteps, the world grows quiet, waiting for the first light of a new, smaller day. The giants have found their rest, not in a valley of green, but in the heart of the earth itself, where the ice remains a witness to the time when the horizon was defined by the colossal, and the long migration to nowhere was the most magnificent journey ever taken. The world of the Pleistocene was not merely a kingdom of ice and wind, it was a world of shifting, deceptive surfaces, where the very skin of the earth could prove as treacherous as a predator's jaw. As the great warming pulses of the late glacial cycles began to thaw the permafrost, the landscape of the Mammoth steppe was punctuated by hidden liquid depths. Here, in the hollows between the rolling hills of Siberia and the ancient oxygen-starved basins of North America, lay the bogs, the fens, and the dark, bubbling tar pits. These were the accidental cathedrals of the ancient world, places where the frantic rhythm of survival met the absolute, eternal stillness of the chemistry of decay. The air above these sites hung heavy with the scent of damp moss, of sulfur, and of stagnant water, a thick, atmospheric shroud that masked the transition from life to geology. In this chapter of our collective history, we witness the giants finding their final rest not on the open plains they once ruled, but in the soft, dark embrace of the mire, where the earth itself became a silent witness to the closing of an epoch. Consider, if you will, the biography of the bone as it enters this silent, anaerobic sanctuary. A bone is more than a structural support. It is a mineralized diary, a storehouse of every meal consumed, every winter survived, and every drop of water tasted from a primeval stream. In the open world, the death of a giant was a chaotic, public unraveling. A mammoth that fell on the open tundra was subject to the adaptation versus cost of the ecosystem's scavengers. The cost was the erasure of history. The gnawing teeth of the hyena and the wolf would splinter the femur. The sun would bleach the ivory to a brittle dust, and the wind would scatter the remains until nothing was left but a ghost in the grass. But the mire offered a different contract, a strange mercy. By claiming the body in its entirety, the mud protected the physical record of the creature from the ravages of the atmosphere. Within the peat bogs and the asphalt seeps, oxygen, the very gas that fuels the fire of life but also accelerates the fire of decay, was banished. In this lightless, airless grip, the giants were sealed away like a sacred memory, their bodies slowly turning into a library of stone. Imagine a day in the life of a great bull mammoth, wandering through a deceptively still peat moor in the lowlands of Beringia. He is old, his massive heart laboring against the weight of 90 years of migration. His hunger is a constant, gnawing companion, as the bitter scrub of the thinning steppe offers little in the way of the calories his mountain of muscle requires. He sees a patch of vibrant green, a cluster of sedges thriving in the moisture of a hidden hollow. To his ancient, clouded eyes, it looks like a remnant of the Golden Age, a promise of the succulent flora he once ate in his youth. He steps forward, his massive circular foot, a masterpiece of pressure distribution, descending onto what he believes is solid ground. But the evolutionary duality of his mass betrays him. The very size that once made him untouchable now becomes a plummet. The soft, waterlogged peat does not hold. It gives way with a wet, sucking sound, the earth itself opening a dark, liquid mouth to receive him. His struggle is a slow-motion symphony of futility. Every surge of his powerful limbs only serves to pull him deeper into the dark, cold embrace of the bog. The biography of the muscle is written in the frantic tension of his shoulders as he tries to leverage his weight against a surface that has no substance. But there is no malice in the mud. It is merely the cold, indifferent physics of the world. As the water rises to his chest, the giant's social bonds, the very thing that defined their life, manifest one last time. He calls out, a low-frequency rumble that vibrates through the peat, a signal of distress to a herd that may already be miles away, or perhaps in this lean era, already gone. Eventually, the fatigue of the long migration catches up to him. He stops fighting. The cold of the mire seeps into his marrow, and he sinks beneath the surface, the dark water closing over his head like a velvet curtain. In that moment, he ceases to be a sovereign and becomes a secret. For thousands of years, these giants lay in the dark, their tusks and teeth holding the chemical signatures of the air they breathed during the interglacials and the plants they ate before the ice returned. The mire acted as a time capsule, a silent error in the code of life that paused the clock of decomposition. While the world above transformed, while the ice retreated, the forests grew, and the first cities of man rose like stone scars on the horizon, the giants remained unchanged in their dark cathedrals. The ivory of their tusks, which in the open air would have cracked and peeled into nothingness, was stained a deep, earthy brown by the tannins of the bog, preserved with a fidelity that allows us, in the distant future, to read the very seasons of their lives. These sites, from the La Brea tar pits in the heart of modern Los Angeles to the permafrost mummy sites of the Yamal Peninsula, are the pages of a book we are only now learning to read. They tell the story of a sudden, sharp conclusion, a world that turned from liquid to solid, from life to limestone. When we exhume a mammoth from the mire today, we are not just finding bones, we are finding a biography of the body in its most intimate detail. We find the contents of their last meal still nestled in their stomachs, the buttercups and the wild grasses of a world that vanished 12,000 years ago. We find the texture of their skin, the density of their hair, and even the parasites that lived in their fur. It is a resurrection of sorts, a way for the giants to speak across the eons. The evolutionary duality of their death is that the very event that ended their individual life ensured the immortality of their story. In the silence of the mire, the giants waited for a future that would finally remember their names. This was the silent witness to the end of the Megafauna. While our ancestors were chasing the herds across the plains, the earth was quietly collecting the remains of those who fell behind. There is a profound, hypnotic peace in the thought of these titans resting beneath the soil, their massive frames cradled by the same earth that once provided their sustenance. They are the foundations of our own world, the hidden mineral wealth that our ancestors sometimes stumbled upon, using the fossilized ivory to carve the first needles and the first icons of the soul. The biography of the tooth becomes a scientific treasure, as the isotopes within the enamel reveal the precise temperature of the Pleistocene winters, allowing us to reconstruct the historical world-building of a climate that shaped the human mind. As you drift towards sleep, imagine the stillness of such a place, a prehistoric peat bog at midnight, under a sky filled with stars that have not yet been named. There is no wind here, only the occasional bubble of gas rising from the depths and the distant lonely howl of a wolf. Beneath the moss, the giant lies in his tomb of strange mercy, a king in state, protected from the ravages of time by the cold, dark chemistry of the earth. He is a memory carved in bone, a testament to a time when life was large and the world was deep. The mire has kept its promise. It has preserved the majesty of the massive, so that we, the small and the curious, might one day look upon it and understand the scale of our own origins. The giants have found their rest, and in the silence of their dark cathedrals, they remain the heartbeat of a history that refuses to be forgotten, waiting in the soft embrace of the earth for the day the world finally wakes up to its own ancient, colossal past. The great silence did not fall all at once. It settled like a slow, suffocating snow over the continents of the Pleistocene. As the last of the mammoths exhaled their final frosty breath into the indifferent air of the Holocene, the earth did not simply move on with a quickened pulse. Instead, it entered a long period of biological mourning, a floral and faunal grief that manifests even now in the very architecture of our modern forests. When the giants vanished, they left behind more than just bones in the mud and ivory in the permafrost. They left behind a hollowed-out world, a landscape shaped by the absent. The sun continued to rise over the valleys of the Americas and the steppes of Eurasia, but the light fell upon a garden that had lost its gardeners. This was the birth of the ecological ghost, the haunting of the modern world by the shadows of the massive. To look upon a wild place today is to look upon a negative space, a mold formed by the presence of creatures who are no longer here to fill it, a tapestry where the most important threads have been unthreaded by time. Consider the biography of the seed. In the golden age of the megafauna, a seed was a traveler, a biological passenger designed for a grand journey through the dark, warm interior of a titan. Many of the most iconic plants of the ancient world had entered into a sacred evolutionary contract with the giants. They produced fruits that were not meant for the delicate beaks of birds or the small, nimble hands of primates. These were the anachronistic fruits, large, heavy, often unpalatable to the modern palate, yet perfectly tailored for the gargantuan. The Osage orange, with its lumpy neon green exterior, and the Kentucky coffee tree, with its leathery pods, are the orphaned children of this lost era. For millions of years, the survival versus vulnerability of these plants depended entirely on being swallowed whole. The seed required the intense heat and the powerful chemical baths of a mammoth's digestive tract to scarify its tough outer shell, a silent error in the code of life that turned a barrier into a gateway. Once past, the seed would be deposited miles away in a rich, steaming mound of fertilizer, a perfect cradle for a new life. But as the giants faded into the mists of extinction, the biography of these seeds changed from an epic of travel to a tragedy of stagnation. Imagine a day in the life of an Osage orange tree in the early Holocene. The fruit ripens and falls to the earth with a dull thud, rolling to a stop in the tall grass. 10,000 years ago, this would have been the moment of its greatest opportunity, the moment a gomphothere or a giant ground sloth would have arrived to claim it. But now, the forest is quiet. There is no rhythmic thundering of hooves, no heavy, musky scent of a master browsing. The fruit lies where it fell, rotting at the base of the parent trunk. Its adaptation versus cost has become a terminal deficit. It is too large for the squirrel to carry and too tough for the deer to crush. It is a biological message sent to an address that has been demolished. We see these trees today in stunted, isolated pockets of the landscape, survivors of a world that has moved on, clinging to the edges of riverbanks where the water might mimic the transport once provided by a giant's gut. The biography of the thorn tells an even more aggressive story of this haunting. If you walk through the woods of the American Midwest or the African savanna, you may encounter the honey locust. Its trunk is often armored with terrifying multi-branched thorns, some nearly a foot long, sharp enough to pierce thick leather. In the modern world, these thorns seem like a ridiculous overinvestment, a evolutionary duality, where the plant spends vast energy to defend against a threat that no longer exists. No deer or rabbit would dare approach such a spike. These are not defenses against the small. They are the ghosts of the mouth. They were forged in the deep time fires of the Pleistocene to deter the velvet-soft, prehensile trunks of mammoths and the leathery tongues of ground sloths. The thorns are a physical memory of a conflict that ended 10 millennia ago. Every time a honey locust grows a new spine, it is preparing for a battle with a phantom. It is a silent witness to the sheer power of the giant's hunger. A hunger so formidable that the trees had to turn themselves into fortresses of bone-hard wood just to survive the afternoon. As the giants vanished, the very structure of the forest began to close in. During the Pleistocene, the mammoths and their kin were the architects of light. By knocking down trees, stripping bark, and trampling the undergrowth, they acted as a continental-scale thinning crew. They maintained the cathedrals of light, ensuring that the forest floor remained an open, vibrant mosaic of grasses and wildflowers. This was the historical world-building of the megafauna. But in the wake of their extinction, the biography of the forest shifted toward darkness. Without the constant pressure of the browsers, the canopy closed. The dense, sun-starved thickets we see today in many protected wilderness areas are not pristine. They are overgrown ruins. The biodiversity of the understory collapsed as the negative space created by the giants was filled by opportunistic, fast-growing timber. The world became darker, quieter, and more tangled, a landscape that had lost its breath. The sensory details of this transition are haunting. Imagine the smell of the world as the megafauna disappeared. The absence of the rich, earthy scent of manure that once fueled the entire nitrogen cycle of the continents. Imagine the sound of the wind, which once whistled across open, mammoth-scoured plains, now muffled by the suffocating density of a closing forest. Our ancestors, the shadows who had watched the giants fall, must have felt this change in the very texture of their lives. The wood smoke of their fires now drifted through thicker woods. The flint of their spears was now used on smaller, swifter prey, like the red deer and the aurochs. They were the first to live in the ghost of the ecosystem, walking through woods that were still filled with the anachronistic fruits they occasionally gathered, perhaps wondering why the trees grew so many thorns, or why the fruit of the osage was so heavy and useless. This haunting is even etched into the biography of the eye for those of us who look at the wild with a scientific gaze. We are learning to see the silent accidents of evolution as clues to a lost reality. When we see a plant that seems out of place, or a defense that seems over-engineered, we are looking at the ripples in the pond created by the stone of extinction. The disappearance of the giants was not a clean break. It was a traumatic amputation, and the ecosystem still feels the phantom limb. The adaptation versus cost of the modern world is still being settled. We see it in the way certain insects, which once relied on the specialized dung of the mammoth, have struggled to survive on the leavings of smaller mammals. We see it in the way the soil itself has changed its chemistry, no longer churned by the massive hooves that once acted as the earth's own plow. Generations of humans have faded into dust since the last giant fell, yet the trait of the haunted landscape remains. The world is a museum of the absent. We are the inheritors of this biography of the body of the planet. A planet that is still recovering from the loss of its most ambitious experiment in scale. The honey locust and the Osage orange are the living fossils of our own backyard, reminders that the present is never just the present. It is a layered accumulation of all the days in the life that came before. The thorns are not just thorns, they are a salute to the mammoth. The fruit is not just fruit, it is a prayer for the return of the sloth. As you drift towards sleep, imagine yourself walking through a primeval forest that is just beginning to realize its masters are gone. Feel the coolness of the deep shade where once there was sun. Touch the bark of a tree that is still armoring itself against a ghost. The world is a quiet, sacred place, filled with the negative space of the titans. We live in the ripples of their passing, in a world that is still, in its own floral way, mourning the loss of the heavy heartbeat and the thundering footfall. The giants are gone, but the earth remembers. It remembers in every thorn, in every orphaned seed, and in the very silence of the woods at midnight, where the ghost of the ecosystem still waits for a mountain that will never again come over the hill. The air of the late Pleistocene did not cool all at once, nor did the giants fall in a single thunderous afternoon. Rather, the world began to unmake itself through 1,000 quiet subtractions. What really happened to the Titans was not a single, isolated event, but a dark convergence of catastrophes, a perfect storm where a changing sky met a new, hungry predator in a collision of deep time and desperate survival. Scientists, in their sterile, brightly lit laboratories, may call this the Quaternary Extinction, labeling it with the cold precision of a ledger. But to the poetic soul, to the ancestor huddled in the flickering amber light of a cave, it was the closing of the Earth's greatest and most ambitious chapter. It was the moment the music of the spheres shifted its key from the majestic and the massive to the minor and the meager. The ledger of the lost is long and heavy, written in the biography of the bone and the silence of the soil. It contains not just the mammoth, but the saber-toothed cats who followed their ivory-bound prey into the final dark, and the giant birds who once ruled the southern islands like feathered monarchs. It was a cascading failure of the colossal, a biological domino effect where, as the keystone species fell, the very arches of the ecosystem they supported crumbled into the dust of the Holocene. Consider the biography of the fang belonging to Smilodon, the saber-toothed cat. This was a weapon forged for a specific titanic world. Those long, serrated daggers of bone were not designed for the small, flighty deer of the modern forest. They were precision instruments of the evolutionary duality built to find the soft throat of a giant. But the fang was a specialist's tool, carrying a high adaptation versus cost. While it offered the power to bring down a mountain, it rendered the cat vulnerable to the disappearance of that mountain. As the mammoth herds thinned, the saber-tooth found itself holding a key to a door that had been permanently barred. We see the cat in the mind's eye, stalking through the thinning scrub of the Rancho La Brea, its amber eyes reflecting a world that was becoming increasingly empty. Its metabolism, high and demanding, could not survive on the scraps of a dying kingdom. The cat did not fail because it lacked strength. It failed because its strength was too specific. It followed the giants into the ledger, a silent shadow trailing its master into the void of extinction. This was the historical world-building of a planet in crisis. The biodiversity of the Earth took a sudden, jagged dive, leaving behind a world that was quieter, smaller, and infinitely more fragile. To understand the biography of the wing of the giant birds, like the moa of the distant south, is to understand the tragedy of the island sanctuary. For millennia, these giants lived in a world without the shadow. Their bodies grew large because the sky was kind and the ground was safe. They were a silent error in the code of life that flourished in the absence of fear. But when the first human canoes cut through the surf, the survival versus vulnerability of the moa was exposed in an instant. They were giants of peace in an era of the spear. The ledger records their passing with a heartbreaking speed. Within a few human generations, the biography of the egg was finished. The massive shells, once the size of a human head, were crushed and used as water vessels, their contents fueling the expansion of a species that moved faster than the birds could ever learn to run. We look back at this time and see a mirror of our own power, the first time our species truly altered the destiny of the tree of life. It was a moment of evolutionary duality for the human being. We were the small, the quick, and the clever, the only ones who could afford the new price of admission to the future. Our biography of the hand allowed us to create tools that bridged the gap between our fragile frames and the giant's mass. A day in the life of a Clovis hunter in the American Southwest was a study in this terrible ingenuity. Imagine him standing on a ridge of red clay, the scent of wood smoke clinging to his hair, his eyes scanning the horizon for the dust cloud of a mammoth herd. He does not possess the weight to stop the beast, but he possesses the flint spark of the mind. He understands that the giants are locked into a cycle of adaptation versus cost that they cannot break. He knows that if he kills the matriarch, the herd will falter. He is the catalyst of the final act, the silent accident of consciousness that turned the tide against the massive. The world was changing its rules, and the giants were the victims of their own perfection. Their bodies were masterpieces of a world that was being redrawn by a cold, indifferent hand. As the historical world-building of the Ice Age gave way to the warmth of the Neolithic, the giants were trapped in their own biography of the body. Their long gestation periods, their reliance on vast, contiguous grasslands, and their slow, majestic pace were the very traits that made them masters of the grass, but they were also the chains that dragged them into the ledger. The adaptation of the mammoth to the cold, the thick fur, the humps of fat, became a cost when the summers grew long and the bogs grew deep. They were wandering through a landscape that no longer recognized them. The sensory details of this cascading failure are haunting. Imagine the smell of the world as the megafauna perished, the thick, sickly scent of decay that hung over the watering holes, the silence that followed the last trumpeting cry of a bull, the way the stars seemed to shine more coldly on a planet that was losing its heartbeat. Our ancestors were the silent witnesses to this unraveling. They were not malicious. They were simply the clever. They were the ones who could live on the margins, who could eat the roots the giants ignored, who could sew the skins of the fallen to survive the nights. The biography of the human heart during this time is one of survival at any cost. Every time a giant fell, a human tribe grew stronger. The survival of the man was bought with the vulnerability of the titan. As the giants vanished, the negative space they left behind was filled by the small. The deer, the elk, and the wolf became the new sovereigns of a shrunken kingdom. The biodiversity dive was a silent error that we are still trying to understand. When the mammoth vanished, the steppe tundra, the most productive ecosystem of the Ice Age, collapsed. It was replaced by the mossy, nutrient-poor tundra and the dense, dark forests of the north. The biography of the landscape was edited, and we were the ones holding the pen. We look back at the ledger of the lost and see the names of those who could not pay the price of admission. The giant beaver, the ground sloth, the glyptodon, the short-faced bear. They were the giants of the Golden Age, and their departure left the world a more fragile place, a garden with too few gardeners. Generations have faded into dust since the ledger was closed, yet the biography of the body of the human species still carries the marks of this era. We have the eyes of the predator, the hands of the toolmaker, and the mind of the survivor. We are the architects of the Quaternary Extinction, the ones who turned the tree of life into a ladder of ascendance. But as we sleep, the ghosts of the giants still move through our dreams. We feel the evolutionary duality of our position, the masters of the world who are also its greatest debtors. The giants did not fail because they were weak. They vanished because the world moved on, and we were the ones who moved with it, carrying the ledger of the lost in our memories like a sacred heavy burden. As the night deepens, imagine the great ledger closing with a soft final sigh. The names are written, the debts are settled, and the giants are at rest. The world is quieter now, the air is warmer, and the shadow has become the master. We are the inheritors of a world that was once defined by the colossal, and as you drift into sleep, remember that you are the descendant of the quick and the clever, the one who survived the storm to tell the story of the giants who stayed behind in the dark. The air in the modern hall is still, filtered by machines and stripped of the scents of the Pleistocene. There is no smell of wild sage here, no biting frost, no musk of wet wool or the metallic tang of a fresh kill. Instead, there is the sterile scent of floor wax and the hushed, reverent footsteps of those who have come to pay their respects to the ghosts. Today, we find the giants not in the wild, but in these quiet halls of museums and the deep, sunless recesses of our own imagination. Their bones, once the flexible, living scaffolding of mountains that walked, have been transformed into artifacts of a lost reality. limestone whispers of a world that once was. When we stand beneath the vaulting ribcage of a mammoth, looking up into the cavernous space where a heart the size of a furnace once beat, we feel a primal shiver. It is a biological echo, a recognition of an ancient connection that transcends the 10,000 years of silence between us. This is the memory in the bone, a physical, mineralized link to a time when the human spirit was forged not in the safety of cities, but in the terrifying and magnificent presence of monsters and wonders. To understand this memory, we must look at the biography of the bone as a survivor of deep time. A bone is not merely a dead thing, it is a crystallized history, a mineral vault that preserves the chemical signatures of the ancient world. In The Living Giant, the bone was a dynamic character. It was the anchor for massive muscle groups, the factory for red blood cells that carried oxygen through a body of impossible scale, and the reservoir for calcium that was traded back and forth between the skeleton and the bloodstream. It was a masterpiece of evolutionary duality, strong enough to support the weight of a cathedral, yet light enough to allow for the rhythmic, swaying grace of the migration. But as the giants vanished, the bone underwent a second transformation. In the permafrost of the Yamal Peninsula or the silt of the North Sea, the organic marrow was replaced by the minerals of the earth. The bone became stone, a silent error in the code of decay that allowed the physical form of the giant to outlast the memory of its species. Consider a day in the life of a modern child standing before the towering femur of a mastodon. As her small hand reaches out to touch the cold, dark surface of the fossil, a bridge is built across the eons. This is the aha of the seeker, the moment when the abstract concept of deep time becomes a tangible, heavy reality. The child feels the awe of scale, a sensory recognition that her own body, so fragile and fleeting, is part of a lineage that once shared the earth with these titans. Within her own biography of the body, there is a hidden legacy. We carry the memory of the giants in our very DNA, for it was the challenge of their world that sharpened our minds and taught us the sacred art of cooperation. Our ancestors did not become human in a vacuum. They became human in the shadow of the mammoth. It was the need to track these behemoths across the Bering Land Bridge, the need to outthink their power, and the need to harness their resources that forced our brains to expand and our languages to grow complex. We are the architects of the giants' end, but we are also the children of their majesty. In the twilight of the Paleolithic, the biography of the story began to take shape around these very bones. Imagine a group of Neolithic wanderers stumbling upon the sun-bleached remains of a Siberian unicorn, or a long-dead mammoth eroding from a riverbank. They did not have the tools of modern paleontology, but they had the furnace of the imagination. They saw the massive tusks, the skulls with their central nasal cavities that looked like the single eye of a cyclops, and the vertebrae as large as stepping stones. From these physical memories, the first myths were born. Our stories of dragons, of behemoths, and of world-crushing monsters are perhaps nothing more than the lingering echoes of these real-life titans, passed down through the fireside tales of 100 generations. The historical world-building of our mythology is rooted in the biography of the fossil. A mammoth skull, seen through the flickering light of a torch, becomes a giant's head. A thigh bone becomes the club of a god. The giants are not truly gone as long as we feel the weight of their mystery in our stories. The evolutionary duality of our relationship with the giants is one of survival versus grief. To survive, we had to unmake them. We had to turn the biography of the trunk into the biography of the leather, and the biography of the tusk into the biography of the needle. But even as we used their bodies to fuel our expansion, we felt the cost of their absence. We see this in the biography of the hand of the first artists. In the dark caves of Chauvet or Lascaux, the human hand did not just record the hunt, it reached out to touch the spirit of the mammoth. The lines of ochre and charcoal are soft, reverent, and precise. They capture the curve of the back and the soulful slope of the eye with a fidelity that speaks of love as much as it speaks of hunger. These paintings are the first memories in the bone, a way for our ancestors to keep the giants alive in a world that was becoming increasingly empty of their physical presence. Scientific discovery today is not a dry recitation of facts, but a sacred unveiling of our own origins. When an archaeologist brushes the dust from a buried tusk, they are not just finding a specimen. They are engaging in a form of necromancy, calling back the biography of the environment that shaped us. Each silent accident in the preservation of these bones, the exact chemistry of the peat, the precise temperature of the permafrost, is a gift to the future. We learn from the biography of the tooth that the mammoths were not just victims of the hunt, but of a world that turned its back on them. We see the adaptation versus cost in their final days, the inbreeding, the nutritional stress, the shrinking horizons of a species that had run out of time. This knowledge is a mirror for our own era, a reminder that even the most magnificent scale of life's ambition can be brought low by the shifting of the wind. The texture of our modern world is haunted by these absences. We see the memory in the bone in the way we still seek the colossal in our architecture and our art. We have a deep biological hunger for the grand, a vestige of a time when we walked among the hills of flesh. The giants live in the aha of the researcher who sequences the ancient genome and finds the silent errors that allowed the mammoth to thrive in the killing cold. They live in the wide eyes of a child who realizes that the ground beneath her feet was once the floor of a different world. They are a silent testimony to the magnificent scale of life's ambition, a reminder that the earth is a place of endless transformation, where today's limestone was yesterday's life. As you drift toward the quiet of sleep, imagine the long, slow history of a single mammoth bone. See it first in the living beast, vibrating with the power of a trumpeting call. See it later, resting in the dark, cold mud of a prehistoric bog, protected by the mercy of the mire. And see it now, standing in the center of a museum, a silent witness to the passage of eons. You are part of this story. Your own biography of the body is a chapter in the same book. The memory in the bone is your memory too, a recognition that we are the survivors of a world of wonders, carrying the legacy of the giants in our hearts and our minds. The hall is quiet now, the lights are low, and the ghosts of the Pleistocene are at rest. But in the deep time of your own imagination, the mammoths are still walking, their silhouettes moving across the golden grass of a world that will never truly be forgotten as long as we remember to look up and feel the awe. The sun rises over the modern Serengeti, a burning amber eye that has watched the world shrink and the giants fall. Yet here, in the shimmering heat of the African plains, the music of the Pleistocene has not entirely faded into the silence of the fossil record. There are places where the giants still linger in spirit, vestigial remnants of a world that refused to completely die. living anachronisms that breathe the air of a crowded human century while carrying the heavy, thundering heartbeat of deep time. We see them in the elephants, the last of the true megafauna, the final sovereigns of a biological dynasty that once spanned every continent and defined the very texture of the earth. To look upon an elephant today is to witness a living echo of the mammoth, a bridge made of gray, wrinkled skin and ancient wisdom that spans the 10,000 years since the great ice sheets retreated. They are the survivors, the lucky few who found a niche in the equatorial heat that could still sustain their majesty, moving through the acacia scrub with the same grace and power that once shook the foundations of the northern tundra. Consider the biography of the skin that drapes across the frame of the modern elephant. It is a landscape of its own, a rugged, mountainous topography of folds and fissures that serves as a silent witness to a million years of adaptation. In the cold of the north, the skin of their cousins was a fortress of wool and fat. Here, in the scorching theater of the savannah, the skin has become a cooling system of intricate complexity. Every wrinkle is a riverbed, a silent error in the code of life that increased the surface area of the body to allow the heat of a 4-ton heart to escape into the breeze. This is the evolutionary duality of the giant's exterior. It is both a shield of impenetrable thickness, capable of withstanding the thorns of the primeval forest, and a sensitive organ of communication, able to feel the slightest touch of a calf or the subtle shift in the humidity of the air. When an elephant moves, its skin ripples like the surface of a deep, ancient lake, a physical memory of the days when the world was wide enough to hold 1,000,000 such mountains of flesh. Imagine a day in the life of a matriarch in the Great Rift Valley, the very cradle where our own ancestors first stood upright in the shadow of her ancestors. The heat is a physical weight, pressing down on the yellowed grass, yet she moves with a deliberate, hypnotic slowness. Within her skull lies a biography of the brain that is perhaps the most sophisticated library of the natural world. She carries the map of every waterhole, every fruiting tree, and every ancestral path within the deep folds of her memory. This is the adaptation versus cost of the giant's intellect. To maintain such a mind requires a decades-long childhood and a social structure of profound complexity, a biological investment that makes her species vulnerable to sudden change, but nearly invincible in times of stability. When she pauses to rumble, a sound so low it bypasses the human ear and vibrates directly into the marrow of the chest, she is speaking across the miles to her kin, a seismic language that was once the primary conversation of the planet. But even these last titans are walking on the edge of a knife, facing a modern echo of the same perfect storm that claimed the mammoths and the mastodons. The historical world-building of the current era is one of fragmentation. The vast, contiguous landscapes they require are being severed by the stone towers and iron ribbons of human industry. The shadow that arrived in the Pleistocene has grown long and heavy, no longer just a clever hunter with a flint tip, but a global force that alters the very chemistry of the sky. We see the survival versus vulnerability play out in the shrinking horizons of the herd. An elephant requires a world without fences, a world where the long migration can still follow the rhythm of the rains. When they are confined to islands of green in a sea of humanity, the math of survival begins to fail once more. They are the modern vestige, a warning and a gift that allows us to look into the eyes of a giant and see the reflection of our own terrifying power. The sensory details of their presence are a visceral link to the Paleolithic. The smell of an elephant, the scent of dry earth, digested vegetation, and a heavy, musky ozone is the same scent that would have greeted a Neanderthal in the valley of the Somme or a Clovis hunter in the basin of the Rio Grande. The texture of their tusks, those needles that unthread the life of a king, is a substance so coveted by the human mind that we have nearly destroyed the giant to possess its ivory memory. This is the tragic duality of our connection. We worship the majesty of the vestige while simultaneously tightening the noose of its extinction. Yet when we watch an elephant use its trunk, that masterpiece of biography of the limb containing 40,000 muscles and the dexterity to pick up a single blade of grass, we are seeing the pinnacle of life's ambition. It is a tool that transcends the spear and the flint, an ancient accident of anatomy that turned a nose into a hand and a weapon into a caress. Generations of humans have faded into dust, yet the elephant remains, a living testimony to the fact that the giants were not myths. They were our neighbors, our rivals, and our greatest teachers in the art of existing on a grand scale. They remind us that the biography of the body is not a fixed script, but a constant fluid negotiation with the environment. As the climate shifts and the world grows crowded, the elephants stand as the final guard of the old world's majesty. They carry the memory in the bone into the light of the 21st century, a silent challenge to our own species to recognize the value of the colossal before the last heartbeat of the Pleistocene is silenced forever. As the sun sets over the African horizon, casting a long, distorted shadow of the matriarch across the dust, we realize that she is the last page of a book we are only now beginning to understand. To lose her would be to lose the last physical evidence of the world that made us. The modern vestige is a chance for reconciliation, a moment to stand in the presence of a wonder and recognize our shared history. As you drift into sleep, imagine the rhythmic, swaying walk of the herd as they move toward the dark. The sound of their breathing is a lullaby of deep time, a steady, ancient pulse that tells us the giants are still here, still breathing, still holding the line against the encroaching silence of the coming years. Chapter 12. The Sleep of the Titans. The fire has begun its slow retreat, the vibrant dancing oranges and yellows of the evening surrendering to a deep pulsating bed of crimson embers. Around us, the modern world falls away, its frantic iron pulse silenced by the weight of the coming night. In this deepening gloom, where the edges of reality soften into the velvet shadows of the primeval, we allow the giants to return to their long, cold sleep. We stand on the precipice of a vast, temporal silence, looking back across the eons to see the final silhouettes of the masters of the grass as they dissolve into the mist. Their story, etched in the frost of the Pleistocene and buried in the silt of the Holocene, is a reminder of the beautiful fragility of life. A profound testament that no matter how large a body may grow or how powerful a heartbeat may drum against the ribs, every living thing exists at the mercy of the delicate turning gears of the cosmos. To look upon the end of the Megafauna is to witness the ultimate evolutionary duality, the magnificent strength of the massive meeting, the absolute indifferent fragility of the environment. Consider the biography of the Earth as a vast, interconnected tapestry. For millions of years, the giants were the thickest, most vibrant threads in this weaving. Their presence dictated the movement of rivers, the density of the forests, and the very composition of the atmosphere. But we have learned, through the tragic unraveling of their reign, that when you pull on a single thread, be it a subtle shift in the temperature of the air or the introduction of a new, clever predator, the whole image begins to change. The adaptation versus cost of the giants was a bargain made with a world that was temporarily stable. When that stability shattered, their biography of the body became a ledger of liabilities. The extinction was not a failure of their design, but a transition of the world's intent, a passing of the baton from the masters of muscle to the masters of mind. We, the small, the quick, and the restless, are the inheritors of their empty plains and their silent, overgrown forests. We walk where they once thundered, our light footprints marking the soil that was once compressed by the weight of mountains. Imagine a day in the life of the very last mammoth, perhaps on the lonely, wind-battered shores of Wrangel Island, thousands of years after her mainland cousins had vanished into the ledger of the lost. She stands at the edge of a granite cliff, her biography of the eye clouded by the cataract of extreme age and the genetic fatigue of a shrinking bloodline. In the silence of the genome, the errors have accumulated. The ancient accidents that once gave her species the strength to endure the ice are now fraying at the edges. She feels the vibration of the sea below, a seismic memory of the land bridges that once connected her world before the rising tides turned her sanctuary into a prison. There is no roar, no dramatic climax to her existence. There is only the slow, rhythmic breathing of a creature that has run out of horizon. She steps softly into the mists of the past, her tusks, those arcs of ivory lightning, gleaming in the starlight one last time before the shadows claim her. She does not die in fear, but in a profound, heavy exhaustion, a sovereign laying down a crown that has become too heavy to bear. The sensory details of this final departure are a lullaby for the planet. The smell of the air is no longer the rich, musky scent of a million-strong herd, but the clean, sterile scent of falling snow. The texture of the ground is no longer the trampled, fertile turf of the steppe, but the mossy, yielding carpet of a tundra that is forgetting its gardeners. In this transition, we see the historical world-building of the Earth shifting its focus. The giants are at peace now, carved into the bedrock of our planet and the sacred architecture of our souls. They sleep in the soil beneath our feet, a hidden foundation of a world that once dared to be massive. Their biography of the bone has become part of the lithosphere, a mineralized memory that supports the very ground we build our cities upon. We carry them with us, not just in the fossils we exhume, but in the biography of the hand that still reaches for the tools of survival and the biography of the heart that still aches at the sight of a vast, empty horizon. Scientific discovery has taught us that the Quaternary Extinction was the forge of our own humanity. It was the presence of these monsters and wonders that demanded we become more than just another primate in the tall grass. We had to learn the sacred art of cooperation, the ability to share a story and a spark of fire, to outmaneuver a giant that could crush us with a single step. Our evolutionary duality is that our triumph necessitated their tragedy. We are the masters of the mind, the shadows who grew into the light, but we are also the lonely guardians of a world that is quieter than it was meant to be. The giants teach us that life is a survival versus vulnerability equation where the variables are always changing. They remind us that our own biography of the body, despite its cleverness and its tools, is still woven into the same tapestry that once held the mammoth and the ground sloth. As you drift into your own slumber, let the memory of the giants be a slow and steady heartbeat that connects you to the deep time of the earth. Imagine the world as they saw it, a sprawling, amber-lit stage of infinite possibility. Feel the primal comfort of the fire as it fades, a reflection of the first fires our ancestors lit to keep the dark at bay. In the biography of the sleep, we return to the state of our ancestors, vulnerable yet dreaming, our minds reconstructing the day in the life of a world where the monsters were real and the wonders were walking beside us. Everything that lived is never truly forgotten. It is merely recycled into the code of the future, a silent error that becomes a new adaptation, a ghost that becomes a guardian. The giants are not gone. They are the soil, they are the stones, and they are the very capacity for awe that allows you to wonder at the scale of your own existence. The night has fully arrived now, and the fire is a dim, flickering memory. The giants have returned to their cold sleep, their work as the architects of the landscape finished, their legacy secured in the marrow of our history. They sleep in the permafrost, they sleep in the tar, and they sleep in the wide, wondering eyes of every child who looks at a bone and sees a mountain. Let the rhythm of their ancient footsteps lead you into the dark, a slow-motion symphony of resilience and grace. The earth is deep, the time is vast, and the giants are at peace. Sleep now in the shadow of the titans, in a world that once dared to be massive, and find your own rest in the knowledge that you are a part of a story that will never, ever end.